There's a question that bothered me. We had read in the Torah that when Avraham had gone to Canaan after he left his homeland, his birthplace, his family, and was promised that's the future, he's there 3 months, he's confronted with a famine. He leaves Canaan, goes to Egypt. Sarah was a very beautiful woman. The Gemara tells us that she was one of the four most beautiful women who ever lived. Sorry, Menu. And you could imagine taking that kind of wife to Egypt, where the people over there were never exposed to such beauty. He was concerned that he'd be killed. They would kill him, take her as the wife of the king. So he asked her that when they go, she should present herself as his sister. So initially, they believed that it was Avram's sister. It was his niece in reality, but it was his wife. And he received tremendous wealth as a dowry for the family. And then Paro has her, and he tries to approach her. Sarah, as a prophetess, was a greater prophetess than Avram was a prophet. She was a very holy woman. So the moment Paro attempted to approach her, she says to the angel, smite him. And the angel smote Paro. He never experienced something like this in his life. And as much as he tried to approach her, he was totally incapacitated. He immediately realized that this woman is a very holy woman. Not only that, he realizes that she's not this man's sister, but yet she's his wife. Immediately, he releases her, and he says to Avraham, "Why did you tell me it's your sister, it's your wife?" And not only was he so impressed with what happened, Hagar, which we refer to as Hagar, was the daughter of Paro. She was an Egyptian princess. And he gave her over to Sarah that she should become her maidservant. And he said, better she should be a maidservant in the home of Avraham than a princess in the palace of Pharaoh. This is how he was able to evaluate Avram's value versus his own. I prefer you be a maidservant in that home rather than be a princess in my home. And that's Hagar's background. She was an Egyptian. That was her pedigree, Egyptian. So Yishmael, when he was born, from the maternal side, he was Egyptian. From the paternal side, he was the son of Avram, which is total different pedigree. Fast forward, Avram goes to the Philistine area, and all of a sudden, Avimelech, the Philistine king, takes Sarah again. Same story over again. And of course, Avram presents her as a sister because he was afraid he'd be killed. And she's with Avimelech, the Philistine king. And he tries to approach her. God comes to Avimelech in a dream and says, you better return that woman to her husband. She's a married woman. If not, you and all your subjects will die. That's what's going to happen. So you have a choice. Return her to her husband, or you're all going to perish. You and your whole kingdom. They're all going to die. But at that moment, he was stricken with what? He was many things. All his inner organs were all blocked, and he couldn't function. Not only him, all his servants, all the members of his household. They were stricken with this, whatever that, with a degree of some kind of paralysis, the systems were shutting down. and he realized this is serious. He keeps her till the morning and he releases her. To Avraham. Did not release her immediately. Morning comes, he explains to his subjects what kind of dream he had, and then he goes and he reprimands Avraham. What did you tell me? That she was your sister? Do you realize the king nearly committed adultery? Rather than apologizing to Avraham and saying, maybe I overstepped my bounds. Would I have even a right to take her against her will? No, he's faulting Avraham, the accusing fingers at Avraham. So two questions. Paro, God didn't have to come to Pharaoh in the dream to say, you better give the woman back. Sarah, the moment he tried to approach him, she said, smite, the angel smote. When it comes to Avimelech, we find you need God's intervention. Sarah wasn't able to tell the angel to smite him, to keep arm's length here. It's only his systems had to shut down that he wasn't capable of doing anything to her. And he and all the subjects were affected similarly. Why, when it came to Pharaoh, she had the ability to summon the angel to smite, and she didn't use the same approach with Avimelech? Secondly, why did God come to Avimelech and not come to Pharaoh? Evidently, without the king coming, without God coming to Avimelech, it wasn't so simple. Avimelech didn't return until the morning. Even after God spoke to him. Only in the morning, he says, and after he discussed it with his subjects, only then did he return her. Now, when he took her, she already was expecting. She was already expecting Yitzchak. When Yitzchak was born, a question arose. Until she sequestered herself with Avimelech, although she was married to Avraham for years, she never conceived. All of a sudden, 9 months later, after, or whatever it is, within that proximity of time, after sequestration with the king, she has a child. Now a new question arises. Who fathered Yitzchak? Did Avimelech father Yitzchak? Or did Avram father Yitzchak? Very serious question. The world, what do they think? Is this Avram's child? Avram is the Prince of God. He was proclaimed by the world as that special person. Or he's the son of this heathen who's this Philistine king. It was a question. What happens when Yitzchak's born? He's born with the identical facial features of his father. They look exactly alike. And we'll see when he matured and he was an adult, you could not differentiate between Avram and Yitzchak. They looked like identical twins. That's how similar they were. So there was no question in anybody's mind, as it says, Avram Huladi as Yitzchak. Avram was the father of Yitzchak. So the obvious question is, why did God have to perform a miracle that Yitzchak should look exactly like his father? So nobody should question his pedigree, who fathered the child. Just keep Avimelech away from Sarah. That there should never be a question who fathered Yitzchak. And why wasn't Sarah able to keep him at arm's length, like with Paro, saying to the angel, smite? And he was smitten. And he understood immediately that he's playing with fire. Avimelech, God had to intervene and speak to him. Relatively speaking, it's like treating with kid gloves. And he had a dialogue with him in the dream, so on and so forth. Questions why? We had mentioned that who is Avram? Avram was the counterbalance to evil in the world. That's who Avram was. And he established himself as this, and he proclaimed it, and he lived it, and he demonstrated it. He defeated the four kings, the four mightiest kings. He was the victor. He had wealth one of a kind. His hospitality, he was world renowned for this. There was no person who was a pagan. His ability of conversion from paganism to monotheism was one of a kind. As we mentioned, no one ever entered his household, a pagan, after he was hosted by Avraham, left the household believing that paganism had any value. He was a confirmed monotheist. That's who Avraham was. Sarah was his partner in this work. As it says, Avraham converted the men, Sarah Imenu converted the women. I mean, how does God allow such a monster, such a heathen, to even approach such a holy woman? Sarah Imenu, as we said in prophecy, she was greater than her husband. And yet, she was in the clutches of this monster. Why should God allow such a thing? So the way I believe it should be understood is this way. A test is a test only if there's a gray area. Meaning, if let's say something is truth, uncontestable truth beyond any doubt, it cannot be denied this is truth. Does a person have choice? A person has no choice. Choice is only if a person believes there's an alternative to whatever this is. But if the level of truth is so absolute that it cannot be denied that it's truth, then you have no choice. According to Meir Simcha of Dvinsk, when we speak at Sinai, that God put a mountain over our heads, and he said, either you accept the Torah or you'll be buried under the mountain. He says, it doesn't mean literally that. He says, the level of clarity the Jews had at the time of Sinai, when God spoke openly to them, and every Jew prophesied in a wake state, the Jews had no choice. The level of clarity was so absolute, there were no alternatives. If there's no alternative, there's no choice. As a result of that, they have no choice but to accept the Torah. That's what happened at Sinai. So therefore, we have to go to Purim, that there was a decree to annihilate every man, woman, and child. In that setting, the Jews made a choice again. Their commitment to Torah there was reaffirmation of that, and they accepted it out of love. It wasn't due to coercion. Coercion is you have no choice, because God presented himself where there was a level of clarity which it couldn't be denied, God's existence. But that's not what existence is all about. Life is the challenge, and if you succeed in the challenge, then you're deserving. Sinai, there was no challenge. There was no challenge. Avraham Avinu. Why was Avraham Avinu considered a challenge to believe or not believe? Because, as we said many times, who is the counterbalance? Who is as convincing to paganism as Avraham was to monotheism? Nimrod, the king who introduced idolatry to humanity, the king who had taken Avraham and thrown him to the kiln. He was the counterbalance to Avraham. And if we go back to the kiln, Avraham came out of the kiln. But what did he do when his brother, he asked his brother, Haran, are you going to bow? And he says, no, I will go into the kiln. And he didn't come out of the kiln. So what did Nimrod establish? That Avraham coming out of the kiln is not irrefutable proof of monotheism. Because if he is, why did Haran come out of the kiln? Automatically creates this doubt. Nimrod is the counterbalance to Avraham. And because he's the counterbalance to Avraham, as a result of this, what happens? There's a question. Is Avraham the way to go? Or is Nimrod the way to go? But as Avraham lives longer, he becomes more credible and more irrefutable, and it becomes a problem. Avraham is not going to live forever. He's going to have a successor. Who's going to be his successor? Yitzchak. That's going to be a successor. If Yitzchak, unquestionably, is the son of Avraham, there's no way to counter Yitzchak's influence. As a result of that, humanity has no choice any longer. If Yitzchak rides the coattails of his father, then he's a force which cannot be contended with. But if Yitzchak's pedigree is in question, he may be the son of that heathen, he's not riding his father's coattails. As a result of that, there's a little bit of a basis to reject him because he has relevance to that heathen who is the Philistine king. So God allowed this scenario to unfold, that the pedigree of Yitzchak should be in question, because this blunted the effect, the total effect of Yitzchak would have on humanity. So Sarah, as great as she was, as great as Avraham was, God did not allow her to keep him at arm's length through the smiting of an angel, because God wanted this question to be in the mind of everyone else. Who fathered Yitzchak? God wanted that question to be a question. And what happens? Yitzchak's born. Identical features as his father. Is that an irrefutable proof? If you want to believe it's a proof. But if you want to ask the question, you say it's a little unusual. All the years she was married to this man, she never conceived. All of a sudden now, she sequesters herself with the king. She conceives now as a child. It may be Avimelech, he may be the father. And the pedigree is not Avraham. But they say, how could that be? He looks exactly like his father. You can't discern, but you never know. Maybe there are other influences which allows that to happen. Because we go back to the question, why then and not before? And it's a question we can't answer. The world can't answer. Once that question is asked, automatically that creates a slight degree of doubt. Once that degree of doubt is introduced, Yitzchak's effect on humanity is blunted, is undermined slightly. Now we could talk about him not being the overt representation, the irrefutable representation of God. Because if there's any relevance to Avimelech, he's not going to have that same level of influence. That's the reason why God allowed this tragedy, the tragic event to take place. It did not manifest as a tragedy, but that Sarah was subject to this kind of trauma, to be allowed to be taken by this man, not given the ability to use her billy club, so to say, her angel, to beat this guy to the pulp, and God had to intervene, was only so this question should be a question. We only find that after Yitzchak was born, Avimelech knew the truth, that he was not the father. Although he added fuel to the fire. No, you pride yourself. A woman like Sarah, people say, by the way, is your child? She says, I prefer not to talk about it. That's the way Avimelech responded. Not till he was a bad man. After Yitzchak was born, we find that Avimelech goes with an entourage of his inner circle, with his head of his faculty, his commander-in-chief general, and they go on to make a pact with Avraham. So what happened? And they said, we see that God was with you. How do we see God was with you? Because we see that you came out of the kiln alive, although you went in, you defeated the 4 kings, and you were the victor, and now you had a child at the age of 100. Therefore, we see God is with you. And if we know God's with you, we don't want to stop with you. And we want a pact with you, a covenant, that for 4 generations, my descendants should be protected from your family. That's what we want. That's what he's asking. The question is, what took so long? He came out of the kiln. That's not enough proof that God's with him. In addition, he defeated the four mightiest kings. Who ever heard of such a thing? A handful of men maximally or single-handedly. That's not enough proof God's with him. Evidently not, because he said it's A, B, C. 1, 2, 3. Firstly, the kiln. Secondly, you were a victor against the four mightiest kings. Thirdly, you had a son at the age of 100. Now that's a confirmation God's with you. I mean, how much do you need to be convinced? You needed the son to cap it off. Otherwise, say you never know. I asked the question. I think it's a very cool question. That has to do with Hanukkah. On Hanukkah, what was the miracle of Hanukkah? So we know, how do we commemorate Hanukkah? Because the Talmud tells us that the Greeks contaminated all the oil in the temple. Every vial of oil had the seal of the high priest, and the Greeks intentionally, they broke every seal and contaminated the oil. They found one vial that was not, the seal was not broken, but that oil was only enough to burn one night. And God performed the miracle, it burned 8 nights. That's the miracle. And how do we commemorate that miracle? We light lights for 8 nights to commemorate the 8 nights. And after eight days, they were able to produce new oil to continue kindling the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash, in the temple. So I asked a question. Years ago, the famous lighter, cigarette lighter, was known the rancid lighter. And a person who had a rancid lighter, he had to buy lighter fluid that once in a while, had to be refilled. Rancid came out with a new lighter fluid. You just put in an ounce, and for the next 100 years, that lighter will burn without being refueled. I think we have to dedicate a holiday that an ounce of oil is the equivalent of barrels of oil, which you need for 100 years. Is that a basis to celebrate? We're celebrating. Could you imagine? One vial burn 8 days. Let's celebrate. Oil and latkes, and you can put whatever you want on the latkes. Applesauce, sour cream, whatever you want. And sufganiyot, jelly donuts. That's the way you sell. Does that make sense? It almost sounds like childish. God forbid. Now, on Hanukkah, we have an assertion right after the Modim, which we Allah Nisim. What did we say in that paragraph? We speak about the war between the Jews and the Greeks. The Greeks were hundreds of thousands, powerful, trained armies. The family of the Hashmonaim were a handful of people. The multitudes in the hands of the few. The powerful ones in the hands of the weak. The evil in the hands of the righteous. The impure in the hands of the pure. There's not one mention of the vial of oil that was enough to burn one night, burned 8 nights. But if that's the most obvious aspect of the holiday of Hanukkah, why isn't it mentioned? We speak about Al Nisim Al Purkan, the miracles and the redemption, all that, not one mention of the lighting of the Hanukkah lights. The miracle of the temple. Why? So Maharal of Prague explains the celebration of Hanukkah is the victory over the Greeks. They tried to Hellenize all the Jews, and it was a spiritual victory. The Jews were able to regain control, and they refurbished the temple. They purified the temple. But you needed unbelievable miracles. How do you have a trained army of hundreds of thousands of soldiers being defeated by a handful of Kohanim, priests? It's the miracle. That is the miracle. And that's why that's the only thing mentioned in the Al-Anisim. So the question is, so why did we need the miracle of the oil? That there was only one vial of oil, which was enough for one night and burned 8 nights. The answer is that if you wouldn't have had the oil, you know what people could have said? It wasn't a miracle. It was guerrilla warfare. The Greeks came from Greece. It was a different terrain. They didn't know the terrain the way the Hashmonaim knew the terrain. As a result of that, that's why the multitudes fell in the hands of the few, and the evil fell in the hands of the righteous. It has nothing to do with God. Nothing. The war, the victory was not a miracle. So what does God do? He performs a miracle that the oil that is enough to burn one night burns 8 nights. So what was the value of that miracle? Not it's to be impressed, but it's a statement. God says, I am here. I am here at this moment. That it should be a revelation on the victory, that the victory is not a human victory, but it's only because God was involved. That's why the Jews were victorious over the multitudes, over the powerful, over whatever they were victorious over. So I needed the oil miracle to be an eye-opener to elucidate and illuminate the reality of what that battle was. That's the moral's answer, the morale of Prague. So that's the question. We find that when the 4 kings went to war against the 5, so the king of Sodom, he was one of the captives. And Lot was taken captive. And it says when he fled from the battle, he had fallen into a lime pit. And the Torah makes it a point. Beros chema. He fell in to a lime pit. When you fall into a lime pit, you don't come out alive. It's so caustic. A person, it's like falling to sulfuric acid. You don't come out. He came out. And it was known, he came out. Well, what was the value he was coming out? The value was, Rashi cites the Midrash, because the whole story of Avraham going to the kiln and coming out of the kiln wasn't so simple that people believed it. Such a thing never happened. But when they heard that the king of Sodom went into the lime pit, came out alive, that gave credibility to the story of Avraham that he came out of the kiln. So God performed the miracle on behalf of the king of Sodom, that what? That he should come out alive, which is an impossibility unless it's a miracle. So people should believe in the miracle that Avraham, although he was thrown into the kiln, he came out alive. So let's ask a question. And as I always say, and therefore what? If the king of Sodom personifies evil at the most extreme level, if he comes out, what does that do with God? He's openly defiant against God. So evidently God, people say God didn't perform that miracle. Didn't perform that miracle. So what level of clarity did it provide? Now people believe that Avraham came out of the kiln. But who took Avraham out of the kiln? Was it God? Well, evidently the king of Sodom came out. Well, the king of Sodom going out, people not believe it was God. Because this man has no relevance to God. Because what he represents, everything is contradictory to God. So what was its value? So what is the Torah telling us? God performs the miracle on behalf of the king of Sodom, so people should believe in the reality that Avraham came out of the kiln. Okay? Let's understand. You believe this could happen. Okay? Sometimes when you see one, you don't see the value. But when you put 1 and 1 together with 2, with another one, two, now you see something. Avraham was a victor over the 4 mightiest kings. But you know what you could say? You could say, Avraham, even though single-handedly he was able to beat, because he knew things of tactics of warfare, which they didn't know. That's why he's able to defeat them. Like guerrilla warfare or some other kind of warfare. That's why he could have victory over the 4 kings. Who says that has to do with God? You know what the answer is? But now that we believe he came out of the kiln, which is unheard of, Nobody had such victory. Evidently, when I put two and two together, whoever took him out of that kiln brought that victory on his behalf. So therefore, it was not guerrilla warfare. It's not because he knew the terrain and he had certain battle tactics, and therefore he was able to defeat the four. That means whoever took him out of the kiln brought that victory. Similar to Hanukkah, that the miracle of the oil elucidates the reality that the battle, the victory of the Hashmonaim was not guerrilla warfare, but rather God performed that miracle. Whoever did one did the other. Okay? Avimelech, we said, is a bad guy. Bad man. God had to come himself to speak to the man. Because there was question, who is the father of Yitzchak? And he added fuel to the fire. As I said, Avimelech knew the truth that he did not. He was not the father of Yitzchak. See, he comes now, he wants to enter into a covenant with Avraham. Why? Because firstly, he came out of the kiln. Secondly, there was a victory over the four kings. And now that he's a son, now we see God's with you. And until now, you couldn't see God was with him. You had the kiln and you had the victory. The answer is no. The kiln, the king of Sodom also came out of lime pits. The victory, it may have been what? It may have been guerrilla warfare. But when you have Yitzchak being born, which he knows reality-wise, that he's not the father, Avram's the father, that sums it all up in retrospect, that every step of the way it was God bringing that about. That he says, now we know that God's with you. Now we better enter into covenant, which we know now that you're a formidable force and we have to deal with you. Therefore, we have to be protected. Therefore, we're coming to ask you to enter a covenant with us for that reason.